All right, since so many young people today are wondering if they're ever really going to get married because they look around, they see so many broken homes and marriages that don't look real happy. And I talk to a lot of dating people who say the dating pool is less than ideal right now, wondering if it ever makes sense to get married. I thought, you know what? If we want a good template for marriage, why don't we go back to a time when the divorce rate was much, much lower, like the 1950s. And so in this video, I want to react to 8 pieces of dating advice from the 1950s. Disclaimer, ladies, this is real advice from the 1950s. This is not the opinion of myself or Altered Marriage or anybody that I'm involved with, so don't come for me. But in this video, we'll look at 8 pieces of advice from the 1950s just to say, man, is there any truth in this stuff? Or is it simply outdated? That's today on RelationShots. Hey, welcome to RelationShots. If this is your first time hanging out with us, don't forget to download your free guide to intimacy. You'll see a link in the description area below. This will help you evaluate 4 areas of intimacy in your relationship: emotional, physical, spiritual, recreational, so that you can find some practical ways to increase connection this next week in your relationship. All right, so today we're going to look at 8 pieces of marriage advice from the 1950s, because of course, if marriages were more successful then, and we want to be successful now, maybe we should go back and look what was working for them, or should we not? Again, my disclaimer is the opinions and advice that I'm about to share are not mine, but are actual information from the 1950s. There were books like Home Economics for Young Housewives and The Good Wife's Guide. And so these are coming straight out of that. There were other things like Housekeeping Monthly, which published in 1955, The Good Wife's Guide. So ladies, I'm not coming for you. This was just what was being put out back then for the women, for how they could show up in their marriages and create awesome, wonderful marriages. So again, don't come for me, but I do want to hear your thoughts. Does any of this stuff make sense? Is there any truth in any of it? Or is it all completely outdated? We shouldn't even think about this stuff, and this is actually sexist, and it's rude, and we should get away from it. So here's the advice piece number 1 from the 1950s. Ladies, always look your best for your husband. Which, that doesn't sound too bad unless you hear the real advice, which is greet your husband at the door with a smile. Make sure you've freshened up before he gets home. A wife should always look her best for her husband. Is that sweet, or is that actually sexist? That's what I'm wondering. Would modern couples agree that this is good advice, or would they say, you know what, this is absolutely terrible? So obviously, some of it's cultural, right? Greet your husband at the door. Most of the wives I know today in the area I live in are actually working women, so they're not waiting at the door to greet their spouses. But what about just the idea? Is there any merit in both men and women wanting to look good for their spouse? Is there any value in, I'm putting effort into the way I look, into freshening up, into making sure I show up well in my relationship? I think there's some value in that. Now, I don't think the relationship should be contingent upon that, right? We're not talking about my love and my commitment to you is contingent on the fact that you show up looking good. But, you know, I don't know if that's terrible advice, that we should try to show up well for each other. Obviously, it's a little 1950s when you say greet him at the door with a smile, freshened up. But I don't think that advice is all bad. I'd love to hear your thoughts. So for each one of these, drop a comment in the section below and go, is this make sense? Is there any truth or not? Advice number 2 from the 1950s is don't nag. Keep the house peaceful. So here's the advice. A good wife knows that her husband's work is more important than hers. Sorry, I can't even say it with a straight face. She should avoid burdening him with her troubles and instead focus on making home a place of peace. Oh, it's hard to even say these things. But so here's what I would say. Don't nag? Absolutely. Listen, nobody wants a nag, husband or wife. We don't need to be nagging in a relationship. Now, I think we've gone too far if we say that either the wife or the husband's work is more important than the other person, and so we wouldn't want to burden each other with all that stuff. There's a fine line between burdening one another with unnecessary stuff, nagging, and sharing with each other the things that burden us, because those are the things that connect us emotionally. That's called emotional intimacy. So we do want to share with each other the things that are burdening us and not feel like, well, I can't share anything because if I do, I'm going to burden you. And oh my gosh, it's going to be too bad. So again, it was hard to read that, but I think there's a couple pieces of value I do see. One, nagging criticism is not of value in the relationship going either way, husband to wife or wife to husband. Two, I think creating a home that is peaceful and without much stress is everybody's idea in marriage. I think both husband and wife would say, I want to come home, and I want to come home to a place of peace. And so I think there's some value in going after that. It just doesn't need to be at the expense of suppressing, in this advice, the wife's voice and what's important to her. Drop your reaction below. Advice number 3 from the 1950s is never say no to your husband. So the advice is this: a wife must always be available to her husband. If he wants intimacy, she should never refuse or make excuses. Right there, I'm going to say, yikes, stop, that's terrible, don't clip this, put this on Instagram and say, this is what Eric thinks about marriage. Again, this is advice from the 1950s. We should have boundaries and we should have autonomy over our own bodies. So neither husband nor wife must always be available for the other person. I think there is value, and we also don't want to be rejecting our spouse, husband to wife or wife to husband, all the time either. But I think when we start talking about our modern relationships and the idea of boundaries, of body autonomy, of consent, this advice certainly is outdated and could border on being unhealthy, toxic, and abusive. So let's go ahead and just ditch that one. I don't have a whole lot I can try to reclaim out of that one at all. Advice number 4 from the 1950s is the husband is the head of the household. Now, a lot of evangelicals would subscribe to this idea, believing that it's biblical. And the advice that was given in the 1950s was this: the man is the provider, and the woman's role is to support him by, watch this, cooking, cleaning, and caring for the children. We're making a lot of assumptions there. We're making assumptions that they know how to cook, that only them should clean, and that they're going to have kids, which none of that may actually be the truth in the relationship. But I think what I've also found in relationships, because I have these conversations over and over and over again, that the men who subscribe to this idea of just being the provider usually end up in relationships where their wives feel emotionally disconnected, because provision is not the only thing that a wife is desiring. She's also desiring emotional connection. And so this is where a lot of couples get into a fight, where the wife feels like she's not being loved by the husband. The husband turns around and says, what do you want from me? I provide everything. I put a roof over your head, da, 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 da. Where when we look back at attachment theory and some other relationship theories, we have discovered that it is not just food and provision of resources that create attachment in a relationship, but it's some way to be emotionally connected as well. So if you're an evangelical, you might not have a problem with husband as head of the household. What that actually looks like walked out might be different in your idea, because most research has shown that even Christian couples who say they subscribe to this husband as head of the household actually live in relationship in reality in a much more egalitarian way than complementarian way. And a lot of relationship research shows that the healthiest and the relationships that the couples report being happiest in are one where power is shared, where opportunities are shared, and where responsibility is shared. So obviously that one's a little more on the traditional gender roles. That may work for some couples. For some, they may feel like that's outdated. Advice number 5 from the 1950s is don't talk too much. I can subscribe to that just on the surface, just universally. Man, you run in your mouth too much. Too many of us run our mouths too much, and our mouth gets us in trouble. There's even a proverb that says, where words are many, sin is not absent. When we run our mouths too much, we're probably doing something that is not helpful. But the problem comes with the advice that actually goes with this, which is this. Let him talk first. Again, I can't even read these. His topic of conversation are more important than yours. Yeah. Can you imagine reading that? And can you imagine in the 1950s reading that as a wife and nodding your head at that and going, oh, that makes sense. Yeah, you know what? Yeah, I think you're right. He is more important than me. And his topics are more important than mine. What am I doing? What am I doing talking first? Let me just sit here. So listen. Relationships don't work. Communication does not work if only one person's voice matters. Period. So I think some of us do run our mouths too much. That's universal. But if somebody is deemed to be more important than somebody else, our relationship is already doomed. So I don't know how you can try to redeem any of that advice in a healthy relationship. Relationship advice number 6 from the 1950s, ladies, is always agree with your husband. Why would you disagree with him? You know he's right. Come on. So here's what the advice says. Even if you think he's wrong, a wife should never argue. A good wife lets her husband believe that he's always right. Now, some of you ladies and some of you wives who I know who will be watching this video are probably giggling and laughing to yourself because some of you do that sometimes. You let your husband think he's right even when you know he's not. You just want to humor him, or you just don't feel like dealing with him right now. So listen, we probably all do that in our relationships a little bit. Sometimes you just be like, you know what? Okay, you're right. You're right. I'll let you think you're right. And so the reaction is this. Should couples challenge each other in a relationship for growth, or does that just create resentment? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. My opinion on that is absolutely. So I think that this advice, I'm going to massage and twist a little bit, and I'm going to say this. Obviously, always agree with your husband is terrible advice, just like happy wife, happy life is terrible advice. So what we took in the 1950s, always agree with your husband, we moved into the 2000s and said happy wife, happy life. And I think both those pieces of advice are terrible. That said, we should not always agree with each other if we don't agree. But I think some couples go too far and they're always responding to one another with truth. If you've heard me say this once, you probably heard me say it 100 times if you watch any of my videos. I believe that when issues are brought up in relationship, we have a number one responsibility, which is to validate and respond with our truth later. My saying is this: validate now, truth later. So, do I think you should always agree with each other? Absolutely not. But I also believe if more often than not you respond to your spouse with your truth about what they presented to you, which is often disagreement, that does not make for a great relationship either. So we need some happy in the middle ground of validating one another even when we don't agree, but then also having an opportunity to share our truth later instead of just responding with truth and not validating. So, no, you should not always agree, but I don't think you should always disagree because nobody wants to be in that relationship either. Advice number 7 from the 1950s is, ladies, cook his favorite meals and serve him first. You know what? This one sounds pretty good. I'm just kidding. Here's the advice. A wife should know her husband's favorite meal and always prepare them. Serve him first before anyone else at the table. So I'm going to go back to one of the previous ones, which was husband is head of the household, which if we want to subscribe to the idea that the husband is a leader, I believe that the husband is a servant leader. So I also believe the husband serves first. That's a biblical model, that if you're a Christian, Jesus was a servant leader. And so for this whole I should sit down and be served and waited on. I know a lot of you are thinking about your grandma and your grandpa and how that was often what happened. Grandpa sat in his favorite recliner and grandma brought him his meal or his sweet tea or whatever he had in his chair while he sat down after a hard day of work, so she served him. But again, the context of many households today is that you have a husband and wife often who are both working or doing different stuff. So this whole idea of cook his favorite meal and serve him is probably a bit outdated. And you could make a case that it is enforcing some outdated and unhealthy power dynamics in a relationship. So I think the idea is hopefully both of us are learning one another, whether it's cooking, whether it's how we feel cared for, and we're looking for opportunities to serve each other in the relationship. And lastly, advice piece number 8 from the 1950s is don't go to bed angry, which is good, ... even if he's wrong. Here we go. I told you this was not mine. This was directed at women being great housewives in the 1950s. And so the advice is just a wife should never let an argument last overnight. She must make peace before bed, even if it means apologizing first. Obviously, this is a very unhealthy dynamic if it's put on one person. Do I think that couples should seek to work through conflict and not regularly go to bed angry? Absolutely. I've done videos on this bad advice of don't let the sun go down on your anger as a literal and always approach to a relationship, because the reality is once you've been emotionally flooded and you are angry, you're probably not going to work anything out in a rational manner, and so sometimes you need to sleep on it. Now, it's not healthy in a relationship to go to sleep on it night after night after night after night with no resolution. Then yes, resentment will build up in those situations. But the fact that we can't go to bed angry ever is probably not realistic, as is not realistic that the burden of peace remain on the wife. And even if the husband's wrong, she has to figure out how to apologize and make peace. That's just bad advice, and that is obviously an unhealthy and toxic dynamic. So I threw all those out there to say, is there any truth in some of that stuff, even though it felt one-sided? You can give your verdict and weigh in the comment section below. But the reality is that healthy relationships do require mutual respect and equality and partnership if we're going to make a relationship work, especially in the modern era. So those of you, next time you're complaining about how bad marriage is and the dating pool and all this other stuff, imagine if you were in the 1950s. Ladies, that would have been the advice to you in the 1950s. So no matter how much you may not like the dynamic today, we're in a better place today than we were in the 1950s. And let me just throw this out there in closing. Only 75 years ago, the advice pieces I just read were regular advice to women and wives from this wasn't just men putting this out, this was other women putting this in Good Housekeeping magazines and written in books on the Good Housewife. And so I say all that to say, at one point, in only 75 years ago, people actually thought that this relationship advice was great and helpful. So it might be that some of the things you believe about relationship today may, in a few years from now, look about the same. Why do I say that? I say that to say, let's hold lightly onto some of the things that we believe wholeheartedly about relationship. And let's be curious, because we might want to be open to the fact that what we think should be actually should not be in order to have a healthy relationship. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on these. Again, don't be trying to take little clips of this and post this on your Instagram and act like I believe any of this stuff. My disclaimer at the start and my disclaimer at the end was these are not the opinions of myself or anybody related to this channel. This was advice from the 1950s, of which I was not even alive. Love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment in the comment section below, and we'll see you next time right back here on RelationShots.